know that given the choice, many victims will not choose arbitration. Many victims will choose the real courts, which takes away the secrecy shields and takes the power to choose the judges away from the corporations. And Michelle Fischbach, she also let her corporate power concerns fly as well. Here she is in the hearing that took place in November in the Judiciary Committee.
You know, what's happened to so many women and others in the workplace is terrible, but I really am concerned that by involving the government in these contracts between adults in the area of sexual harassment and assault, we're opening a door for more government involvement in other areas of contracts.
But the Republicans lost this battle. And so now H.R. 445, the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act of 2021, became law. I personally, as someone who works and is a customer, that's what I identify as, I consider this a really good bill and I'm happy that it's law. But the Republicans were not on my side on this. And I say that because 97 of them voted against this bill in the House.
So damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to the 249th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. I just had to check on that. I didn't know what episode number this was because this was supposed to be episode number 248. I've actually been working on this for a really long time, but then I had to change my schedule when war broke out in Ukraine. And so this is actually the 249th episode. And this episode is going to be kind of a hodgepodge of topics because today I want to catch you up on some new laws that have flown completely under the radar while the whole world has been rightfully focused on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And some of these new laws could affect you or someone you love, and so I think that you should know about them. Because one of them is going to affect the drinking water of tens of thousands of Americans. One of them is going to grant you new rights. And then one of them actually probably won't affect you, at least not directly. But this law makes needed changes to the oversight board, which is known locally by the people of Puerto Rico who hate it as the junta, that has been in control of Puerto Rico's finances since the Obama administration. And since we have been kind of following this whole situation with the board for all these years, I think long-term Congressional Dish listeners will want this update. There is one new law, however, that I won't be able to tell you about in detail today. That is the government funding law for fiscal year 2022. Yes, it is done. But the reason I can't tell you all the details is because that law is 1,068 pages long. And that's the version, by the way, of the law without the giant margin. So this is the version that's written in single-spaced paragraphs. It's like a really dense book of 1,068 pages. The version that looks like a classic bill with the big margins, that one is over 2,700 pages long. And what's crazy about this, and this won't be all that surprising to long-term listeners, but the text of that heinously long bill was released to not only the public, but also members of Congress on March 9th, and the House of Representatives passed it the same day. The Senate passed it the next day on March 10th. But what that means is that there is a 0% chance that your member of Congress had enough time, even with the help of their staff, to read this thing. And once again, I am finding myself filled with rage over the job performance of our Congress. Because this is not how the government is supposed to be funded. The government is supposed to be funded by, well, first of all, September 30th of every year. So they definitely failed at that, considering it became law 5.5 months later in mid-March. But the way this is supposed to happen is by September 30th, there are supposed to be 12 separate, carefully crafted government funding bills that fund different parts of our government. But I've never actually seen that happen in the decade that I've been producing Congressional Dish. Instead, what keeps happening over and over again is that our government is funded late, like I said, 5.5 months late this time. And it's funded like this in one giant bill, an omnibus bill with all kinds of other bills attached. And so, for example, just from reading the table of contents, I know that attached to this government funding law were dingleberry bills, including the Credit Union Governance Modernization Act. How are we changing the governing of these banks? Don't know. It's a dingleberry. Another dingleberry for the banks, or maybe against the banks, who knows, is the Adjustable Interest Rate LIBOR Act. And the LIBOR rate is the one that some bankers were caught rigging a few years ago. And so how did Congress adjust the laws in response to that? Like, don't know. This was dingleberried into law. Another dingleberry on here that I think that I'm going to have to read is the Haiti Development, Accountability, and Institutional Transparency Initiative Act, which is the type of title that often hides something kind of regime changey. So I wish our Congress had carefully considered that one. I'm actually happy to see this dingleberry. The Violence Against Women Act reauthorization was finally put into law, not on its own, but as a dingleberry, but you know what, I'll take it. An interesting one here, though, just from the title, is the Israel Relations Normalization Act. What does that mean? Don't know. I also don't know what's in the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Program. Also sounds like a military industrial complex gift, but I don't know because I haven't been able to read it. And neither did your members of Congress. There's also the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act that has something to do with changing our immigration system, but I don't know how because I didn't have time to read it. There's another COVID supplemental, which throws more money at the COVID situation, which is really interesting to me considering I just came back from Portugal where, by the way, everyone is wearing masks. It's not even questioned there. Everyone's being cool about it. I felt very safe there. Everything is open. The clubs are open. The bars are open. But indoors, people are wearing masks because we have an airborne virus floating around. And here in New York, which has the reputation of actually being like more careful than other places in the United States, there's no one in this hotel that's wearing a mask. Joe and I are the freaks that still are because call me crazy, but I don't really want the virus that is giving people long-term forms of some kind of brain damage. We call it long COVID, but more and more studies are coming out showing that it's essentially brain damage. And I don't fucking want that because my job requires me to use my brain. So yeah, it's really interesting to be coming back into the States right now and seeing that we're going to throw more money at COVID at the same exact time that we're basically done, I guess, trying to do anything about limiting the transmission of COVID. But again, I don't know what's in that supplemental because we only had a couple of hours to look at this before it became law. And one provision in here that actually most people do seem to know about at this point is that the government funding law dingleberried loads of money for Ukraine. And by the way, that's the stuff that's visible from the table of contents. The demons are always lurking in the general provision sections of these government funding bills, and these general provision sections are all over the bill. So those are the things that I have to look at really closely. And in fact, this year, we already know that there's a lot of stuff attached to this particular government funding law because one of my favorite congressional reporters, his name's Jamie Dupree, he counted 470 pages worth of earmarks. Now, I'm guessing that he's reading the 2,740 something page version, but regardless, that's a lot of earmarks. Now, earmarks are pet projects that are slipped into bills by members of Congress. So they're not always bad. Like they'll fund a bridge in your community or a community center, but they're also excellent opportunities for favors to be handed out to the people who bribe, or to be diplomatic about it, who contribute to the campaigns of our members of Congress. So we have to watch the earmarks closely. And you can't really do that when they're available to read for just a couple of hours. Oh, and by the way, we're not calling them earmarks anymore, at least not officially. Now they're called congressionally directed spending. But it's an earmark. Everyone knows that it's an earmark, even if they call it something else. And so when the government is funded like this, our country gets set onto all kinds of paths that we peasants are unaware of. That's the real danger here. And some of these paths that we get put on in these funding laws end up having serious consequences. So, for example, exactly a year ago, I released an episode about the economic war that Congress expanded against Belarus, which allowed President Biden to sanction Belarusians and Russians and their families for expanding a partnership between the two countries, and allowed unlimited funding in fiscal years 2021 and 2022. So this is still in effect for groups outside of Belarus to do whatever it is they do to expand the role of the private sector inside Belarus. Did a whole episode on it. I suggest you listen to it. But the thing about that provision is that it was buried in Division FF of the 2021 government funding law. And so the word Belarus wasn't anywhere to be found in the table of contents. You had to really dig to find that one. And now here we are, exactly 1 year later, and Russia and Belarus together are waging a violent war on Ukraine as the United States and NATO countries use every economic weapon that they have at their disposal to wage a crippling economic war against both countries. And those weapons that we're currently using were authorized via a dingleberry on an omnibus spending bill a year ago. That law loaded the weapon, and President Joe Biden is firing it right now. And so what I found is that reading these laws, in a lot of ways, it's like reading a crystal ball, because it was reading a law that even clued me in that anything weird was happening in Ukraine 8 years ago. Because I knew about the Ukraine coup in 2014 because of a law funding the new leaders in Ukraine, the new leaders that were handpicked by Victoria Nuland at the State Department and our ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. But that was a law that landed on my desk that sent those new leaders of Ukraine lots of our money and authorized the first shipments of weapons. And those are weapons that they have been using to try to violently stifle dissent in the eastern half of Ukraine for 8 years now. Those are the weapons that were used by the new government against other Ukrainians who resisted the coup that we assisted in implementing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should listen to, what did I call it? There's an episode I recently did in December on Ukraine. I can't remember what I called it, but I'll put it in the show notes for you. But year after year, I documented, because I'm reading these laws, that we were sending more and more money and more weapons. And the thing is that I've been doing this using a MacBook Pro in my apartments all over the country. Anyone can do what I'm doing, including the multi-millionaires responsible for informing us on TV. But for 8 years, Ukraine was off most of the country's radar. We had no idea that we were funding a new government that we had kind of helped install. And then here we are in 2022 and war breaks out. And our whole country seems to think that this happened out of nowhere. Like this is some kind of surprise. The highest paid, most visible, most trusted journalists in this country are ignoring these laws and leaving us unprepared. They're like purposely not looking at these crystal balls. And even though I'm looking at these laws and stuff, and I can't predict the future, I don't actually have a crystal ball, I will bet every penny that I own that these same journalists that get so much money and so much attention are not going to carefully dig through this new government funding law either. And as if that weren't bad enough, the people who vote on these laws, they don't even look inside these crystal balls before they cement our future. And the irresponsibility of that, every year, it fills me with uncontrollable rage. Now, right now, when it comes to this new law funding the entire government, the only thing the press is really reporting on is the part that sends money and weapons to Ukraine. And I do get it. Ukraine, it's going to get a lot more money and a lot more weapons, and people want to know what that's all about. And since that war is still raging as I speak, another thing that gives me uncontrollable rage, I did read that section for you. But the rest of that 1,068-page law with dozens of dingleberries attached, that's going to take me some time to get through. But I will get through it. This year, I've committed to making sure that not a single page of these things goes unexamined. And so that's what I'm going to work on. And it's going to take me months, but I am going to find and expose the secrets buried within this. But for now, since doing that over the last 2 days was impossible, for now, let's just take a look at the parts of the new law that send our money to Ukraine. Because there is some important crystal ball type information in these provisions. And especially if we want to help stop the war using our negotiation power, the only power that our country really has if we're not planning to actually get into the fight. Well, when it comes to helping with negotiations, this new law is not going to help. But first up, let's take a look at the money. So I want to start with the money that I think is completely uncontroversial. And I know I for sure want to be sending to Ukraine. And that is the money that's going to help the people that are fleeing the bombs, the humanitarian money, if you will. So when it comes to food, the Department of Agriculture is going to get $100 million for Food for Peace grants. And then the State Department is going to get $1.4 billion for refugees. And then on top of that, $2.65 billion to countries that are housing the Ukrainian refugees. And that money is going to be for emergency food and shelter. So when it comes to the humanitarian assistance, I saw about over $4 billion for that. And I personally think that's money well spent. But far more money is going to go towards waging the actual war. So basically fuel for the violence. So the Department of Defense, looking at the details here, this is where I think there's some crystal ball action going on, because $195.5 million is going to go towards U.S. military personnel from the Army, Navy, Marines, and the Air Force. Keeping in mind that we have been promised that there will be no troops on the ground there, I am a little confused why we need almost $200 million for military personnel to respond to Ukraine. That is confusing to me. I'm also a little concerned that there's $213 million specifically for Air Force procurement. We have said that we are not going to implement a no-fly zone because, what a no-fly zone means is that no one can fly over Ukraine, which means that if Russia were to fly jets over Ukraine, we would have to shoot them down, which means we would be in full-on World War III. So that's why there is resistance to the no-fly zone. And so when I look at this and I see that the Air Force is getting $213 million to buy ships, that is also a little interesting. Let's just put it like that. So just keep that in mind as you watch the news and the rhetoric about the no-fly zone. The Air Force in particular gets to buy quite a bit of new toys. We are also going to be putting $300 million in the operation and maintenance account for the whole Defense Department. That's going to be used for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative has been in existence since the coup in 2014. And when you look at this particular money, I also find it interesting that that money can be used for salaries and stipends of Ukraine's military, in addition to their equipment and their support, which I just think goes to show one more time that we are not neutral in this situation. We have been building Ukraine's military. We have been training Ukraine's military since the coup. And now we are funding a jobs program within Ukraine to pay more people to fight on their side of the war. So and we've been doing this for a long time, but I just want to let you know that that's still happening. We are still the people that are paying for Ukraine's military in every way. The biggest chunk of money in here is $5.5 billion for operations and maintenance, and it's very vague. It says it is to respond to the situation in Ukraine, whatever the hell that means. And $3.5 billion of that $5.5 billion is going to be specifically for replacing weapons that will be given to Ukraine for, quote, defense services, unquote, and for, quote, military education and training, unquote. And this is all for the government of Ukraine. So again, if we're spending $3.5 billion for services and training, that means that we are actually involved militarily, regardless of what we're being told. And we need to know that, because that is escalation fuel. And in some ways, I feel even guilty talking about this right now, because we're publicly saying that our members of the U.S. military are just on the sidelines of this. They're not. They're clearly still not. We need to be aware that what they are saying and what the law is saying, those are two completely different things. There's also money in here for the State Department. So there's going to be $650 million for the Foreign Military Financing Program. That money can go not only to Ukraine, but also to countries impacted by the situation. So that can be any of the countries that border Ukraine as well. They can get more military equipment. So I think that's what they're probably going to use to give more equipment to NATO countries. They are also expanding the emergency powers of President Biden in 2022 alone to allow him to provide $3 billion in military equipment, services, and money to foreign countries and international organizations. So that is $3 billion that isn't just going to Ukraine. It's going to whatever international organizations means in any other country. So that kind of goes into a black hole. And that is far more money than the president is usually allowed to give out in this kind of like shady, dark money kind of way. Usually there is a limit of $100 million per year, and that is increased this year to $3 billion. There's also another chunk of money here for the State Department that I think is designed to get around legal limits that we have in place now when it comes to transferring money and weapons to other countries. Because the State Department section authorizes $4 billion for direct loans to Ukraine and NATO countries. But that also comes along with permission to reduce or cancel their obligations to pay us back. So it is technically a loan, but if it's forgiven, then that's another gift. And the amount provided this way, quote, shall not be considered assistance for the purposes of provisions of law limiting assistance to a country, unquote. So that's why I think that they're trying to weasel around limits there, because it says so in black and white in the law. There's also one section in here that I just want to put out there. I don't know how effective this is going to be, but it has to do with the Azov Battalion. So there's been a lot of buzz about this lately, but basically the Azov Battalion, which is also known as the Azov Special Operations Detachment, it's a pretty infamous Ukraine-based neo-Nazi military regiment that was founded by white supremacists in May of 2014. So this was right after the coup. And they have been fighting on the side of the Ukrainian government in the civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine. So basically, they've been fighting for the Ukrainian government against the Ukrainians who resisted the overthrow of the president that they had elected, who had decided to partner economically with Russia instead of the IMF. Again, if that is something that you don't know what I'm talking about, you have to listen to that episode I produced in December about Ukraine. There's a lot of backstory there, and it's key to understanding why the war is even happening. But anyway, so these Nazi guys have been fighting in the Ukraine civil war on the Ukraine government side. And the United Nations Office of the High Commission for Human Rights reported in 2016 that these Azov Battalion guys had looted civilian properties in the Donbass. The Donbass region is where the civil war has been raging since 2014. And the UN report accused these guys of raping and torturing Ukrainians in the Donbass who were being held as prisoners. So these guys fucking suck. Now, flash forward to now, and the Azov Battalion white supremacists have been credibly reported to be a part of the Ukrainian National Guard. And we know that the CIA and our military has been training and funding pretty much all of the different divisions of the military in Ukraine since that 2014 regime switcheroo. And so since we were likely training their National Guard as well, that means we have likely been training these motherfuckers. There's also reports from the Atlantic Council confirming that the Azov Battalion received lethal weapons from the Trump administration in 2018. And so that information got out since the war began, or I shouldn't say began because this actually began in 2014. But since Russia went with their big invasion at the end of February, word about the Azov Battalion got out. And so Section 8141 of the Omnibus says, quote, none of the funds made available by this act may be used to provide arms, training, or other assistance to the Azov Battalion, unquote. So it is now illegal for us to fund these people. Does that mean we're going to stop funding the National Guard in Ukraine? I don't know, but you would imagine that's what it should mean. But I mean, could they just change their name and then get funding? Like there's ways around this, but it would be illegal for weapons or money to end up in their hands. How does that get enforced? I'm not sure, but just know that is the law now. One more thing I want you to know about is that this new law also provides some propaganda money to the State Department. So there's going to be $647 million for the Economic Support Fund in the State Department. And it says that that specifically can be transferred to fund activities, quote, related to public engagement, messaging, and countering disinformation, unquote. That means it's for propaganda. And then There's some other money for the State Department you should know about, which is $1.12 billion for Ukraine and other countries, Poland and Hungary in particular, that are enacting IMF economic reforms and expanding the private sector. So that has all to do with Ukraine. And that's just like that. I consider that a dingleberry buried in the Ukraine money to go towards expanding the world trade system by the State Department, because that I don't see what in the fucking hell that has to do with the war in Ukraine, but that's in there. So when you see that like I think they're reporting $13.6 billion is going towards Ukraine, just know that $1 billion of that is going towards expanding the private sector in surrounding countries. So crazy. All right. So that's where all the money is going. But the part of the Ukraine section of the funding law that concerns me the most has to do with what we can negotiate for. Because as I concluded in my last episode, the one I kind of put together very quickly called Understanding the Enemy, where I'm at on this is like, as Americans, what can we do to end the war? There's really two ways that we can get involved and end it. One is we get involved militarily, beat Russia, drop a bunch of nuclear weapons, basically launch World War III and win World War III. That's our military option. Not a big fan of that one. The other one is negotiations, which involves compromising with Russia on their demands, not all of which are completely insane. And if you want to know why I say that, please listen to the episode called Understanding the Enemy. It was the last one that I produced, and you'll see exactly why I say that. I don't think that all of Putin's demands are insane. And so when I looked inside of this government funding law, there were two provisions in here that have me really concerned, because they're kind of going to prevent us, not kind of, they are going to prevent us from compromising with Russia. So the first one that has me concerned is in the Department of Defense section. And what it says, this is section 8140. It says that prohibitions against Russia will not be lifted until, quote, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have withdrawn from Crimea, other than armed forces present on military bases, unquote, that were agreed upon by the Russian and Ukrainian governments. Now, remember, after the coup in 2014, Russia took control of a peninsula that hangs off of the bottom of Ukraine in the Black Sea called Crimea. Crimea is home to a military base that houses Russia's Black Sea fleet, and Russia was renting basically that space from the Ukrainian government that was overthrown. And so instead of basically trusting this new coup government, what they did is they took control of Crimea. They didn't have to invade. Their military was already there. But since 2014, Crimea has been Russian. It just has been. And so what this tells me is that we are not legally allowed to accept that as reality. There's also a provision in the State Department section that says the same things and expands it. So section 7047 says, quote, none of the funds appropriated by this act may be made available for the implementation of any action or policy that recognizes the sovereignty of the Russian Federation over Crimea or other territory in Ukraine, unquote. Essentially, this is going to end when the Secretary of State certifies that, quote, the government of Ukraine has reestablished sovereignty over Crimea and other territory in Ukraine under the control of Russian-backed separatists, unquote. That second part has to do with the Donbass region. The Donbass region is where the civil war has been raging in the eastern part of Ukraine for 8 years. That is the region that when President Putin of Russia gave his speech, he said, I am going to declare this region as independent. And he said that is really what this military operation of his is all about, is getting that region to be independent. Now, it's important to keep in mind that was the solution, more or less, that was agreed to in 2015 by the world. There was an agreement. It was called the Minsk Agreement. In that agreement, Ukraine was going to give the Donbass region a level of independence, essentially making it like its own state, but Ukraine was still going to be like the federal government in that situation. Obviously, that's not a perfect analogy. It's a very different country with a very different constitution, but it was going to have a level of autonomy within Ukraine. But over the next 7 years, Ukraine did nothing to actually change their constitution to make that happen. And so when you look at the situation, Russia basically said, all right, if you're not going to make this an independent region within Ukraine, then we're going to make it actually independent and we're going to do it by force. What this new law does is it makes agreeing to that impossible, or at least impossible and legally here in the United States. So it really does tie the hands of the Biden administration to make those two concessions, which again, I don't believe are completely insane, especially the Crimea one. It has been Russian for 8 years. The people that live there seem to be fine with it. It doesn't make any sense for the United States to still be pushing for Ukraine to take back Crimea when it's just not going to happen and everyone seems to be aware of it. Yeah, that's one of the things that I just think that we need to be aware of and that needs to be changed in law in order for us to negotiate in any meaningful way with Russia, because I just don't see how this ends without some kind of independence for the Donbass. And definitely, we have to drop the idea that Crimea is ever becoming Ukrainian again. It just isn't. So yeah, thought you should know that. Okay, so moving along away from the Ukraine war, let's get back to government funding. So the government has finally been funded for 2022, 5.5 months late. But over the course of those 5.5 months, Congress had to kick their funding deadline 4 times, each time with must-sign funding bills that had to be signed or else there would have been a government shutdown. But the thing is that every time they do this, anytime we are being governed while there is a extension of their deadline, there are consequences for the functionality of our government. Because when they kick their own deadlines into the future, the government functions on what are called these continuing resolutions, or CRs for short. Those are the bills that kick the deadlines forward. And since September 30th, they have had 4 continuing resolutions become law. So the first one moved the deadline from September 30th until mid-December. The second one kicked the deadline from mid-December till mid-February. The third one kicked the deadline from mid-February to March 11th. And then the fourth one was a 4-day continuing resolution signed on March 11th in order to buy the Democrats a long weekend to go on a retreat in Philadelphia. Now, that fourth continuing resolution should be the last one, at least until they miss their deadline on this upcoming September 30th. But the omnibus for 2022 should be law by the time you hear this episode. But one of the consequences of letting the government function like this, letting it be funded by CR after CR, is that we prevent the federal government from operating based on their current needs. Now, I watched a hearing that took place on January 12th, 2022, so a month before the second CR had expired. And the hearing was in the House Committee on Appropriations, Subcommittee on Defense. And in that hearing, the heads of the military came to testify about why they needed the government to be funded for real. They testified why it was not only hard, but also very expensive for them to do their jobs while operating under a CR. And so in this hearing clip, you're going to hear Mike McCord, who is the Undersecretary of Defense. He's basically like an accountant for the Defense Department. And he's addressing the idea that was floated by Republicans to just use a CR to fund the government for the whole year, or maybe even the entire Biden administration. Well, the military didn't like that idea.
First, as I believe you are all aware, a full-year CR would reduce our funding level below what we requested and what we believe we need. On the surface, at the department level as a whole, the reduction to our accounts would appear to be about $8 billion below our request, which would be significant even if that was the only impact. The actual reduction in practice will be much greater because we would have significant funding that's misaligned, trapped, or frozen in the wrong places and unusable because we don't have the tools or flexibility to realign funds on anything like the scale we would need to fix all the problems that the chiefs are going to describe.
And he also pointed out that this is the reality when the government is functioning under a continuing resolution.
I know all of you are very familiar with the fact that virtually all military construction projects in each year's budget, including the FY22 budget, are new starts that cannot be executed under a CR.
And it's not just the military. They were the only ones invited to testify, but every part of the government that isn't funded properly has the same problem. They operate on lower funding levels than they often say they need, and they can't start any new projects until the government is funded for real. And so for the last 5.5 months, that's been the case for the whole federal government. So like the infrastructure law, for example, all those things that I've been telling you about in the episodes I've produced about the infrastructure law, all of those are authorizations. Those are permission slips. But the money hasn't even started going out yet, and so none of those projects have started. Essentially, the whole damn government has basically been put into a holding pattern. And this Congress has had the government in this holding pattern for half a year, for a quarter of the Congress. It's a dreadful job performance, if you ask me. And it's not just this 2-year Congress. These people currently in charge have been governing like this for a very long time.
The 6 longest CRs in the history of the Defense Department have all occurred in this last 12-year period. We have turned a 12-month fiscal year into an 8-month fiscal year in terms of our ability to initiate new starts and enter contracts. This should be unacceptable and not the new normal. It's hard to see this full impact because, or the inefficiency from looking from outside, because the organization has, of course, adapted to its circumstances, just as organisms do. Nobody plans to enter into contracts in the first quarter of a fiscal year now because the odds that we would actually be able to do so are so low. Therefore, we in turn have no significant contract delays to report to you when we're under a CR.
How crazy is that the military has had to change how they do things because they are depending on annual congressional dysfunction? Now, obviously, that's smart on the part of the military leaders, but it's also awful that they have so little faith in us as voters that we will fire these people and replace them with people who are at all competent. And when I hear this, I just get so frustrated because it's our responsibility to get our Congress under control. I'm starting to go a little batshit, documenting this level of dysfunction year after year after year. Dysfunction that's only getting worse. I'm watching these same individuals in Congress, many of whom have been serving in Congress for most of the 40 years that I've been alive. I'm watching them constantly one-up themselves with more and more brazen stock market trading and campaign contribution, bribery. And then election after election, I watch us hire them all back after they do a terrible job for us in the job we're hiring them to do. In 2020, 38 states rehired every one of their members of Congress. And in the country as a whole, 96% of the current members of Congress who ran for re-election were rehired by their districts. And so that means that we either overwhelmingly approve of the jobs that they're doing for us, which I don't believe to be true, or it means that the American people have no fucking idea what's going on in Congress. And I think that's the most likely thing that's going on here. And the fact that the two parties have been slowly but effectively changing, aka rigging, laws to make sure that only Republicans and Democrats can win elections, well, that certainly helps them with this as well. But really, this is on us because we don't have to vote for them, but we keep doing it. And how long are we going to keep this up for? Like, are we just done governing ourselves? Are we just surrendering our government to elite, corrupt, actually crazy people? Because as I watch people in Ukraine dying to defend their government, I can't help but be disgusted at how little we value our own. We seem to have just surrendered control of it, to have let it rot to this point, to ignore our own corruption year after year and hire them back year after year. Like, have we just given up? Do the elites and corporations just own Congress now and we're like fine with that? Because we're sure acting like it. And so, since these members of Congress generally face absolutely no consequences from voters for passing CR after CR, well, after this testimony about how bad CRs are for the military, support the troops and all, Congress passed another CR. CR number 3. And attached to that one was one dingleberry. Now, dingleberries are the reason that I always read the CRs because the consequences of not passing a CR into law is a government shutdown, and members of Congress, at least in the Congressional Dish era, have loved to attach to these bills so that they can hitchhike their way into law. But on fiscal year 2022, CR number 3 at least, which became law on February 18th, at least the dingleberry on that law was a good one. It was a dingleberry designed to clean Hawaii's poisoned drinking water. Because you may or may not have heard But the military literally poisoned the water on my former home island of Oahu, which is the island that most people, if you think of Hawaii, it's the one that most people do visit. It's the one with Pearl Harbor and Waikiki and the big waves on the North Shore. But the poisoning happened right next to Pearl Harbor at the Navy's Red Hill facility, which stores jet fuel for the military. The Red Hill jet fuel storage facility was constructed in the early 1940s during World War II, and it consists of 20 tanks mined inside of a volcanic ridge near Pearl Harbor. Each one of those 20 tanks is roughly the height of a 25-story building. So this thing is huge. And here's Representative John Garamendi of California with more on its backstory.
Why does Red Hill exist in the first place? Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had grown concern about the vulnerability of above-ground fuel storage tanks. In 1940, the construction began on the Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, a one-of-a-kind engineering innovation that would secure the fuel from enemy aerial attack. The facility holds 250 million gallons of fuel in 20 steel-lined underground tanks encased in concrete. These tanks are connected to 3 gravity-fed pipelines running 2.5 miles to Pearl Harbor fuel piers. However, a statistic less commonly quoted by the DoD is that the facility is also 100 feet above the groundwater aquifer that provides water to the residents of Oahu. Thus, it has always been the responsibility of the military to ensure that these tanks are maintained in a manner that not only protects the wartime fuel supply, but the people of Oahu's water supply.
Well, the Navy went and fucked that up and poisoned Oahu's drinking water on November 20th or 21st, right before Thanksgiving. Basically, right before Thanksgiving, the Navy reported that there was a spill that came from a drain and that flowed from a fire suppression system into a tunnel. They estimated that there were about 14,000 gallons of fuel that leaked. And the Navy began, when they announced the spill, by telling the residents of Oahu that the water was fine. So like Hawaii Public Radio published an article 2 days after the spill telling the public that the Navy said, quote, there were no signs the fuel had escaped into the environment and drinking water is safe, unquote. But here's Rear Admiral Blake Converse. He's the Deputy Command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and here he is testifying to the House on January 11th.
Beginning on November 28th, residents of certain neighborhoods on our joint base Pearl Harbor, Hickam here in Hawaii, and the military housing began reporting vapors, discoloration, and contamination of the water provided by the Navy. The Red Hill shaft well, which sits near the Navy's Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, was immediately suspected to be the source of this contamination, as that was the source of the drinking water for those affected neighborhoods. So it was shut down that evening, November 28th, and it has remained isolated since that day. Later, samples from the Red Hill shaft well would confirm the presence of petroleum contaminants.
And those petroleum contaminates contaminated the drinking water for about 93,000 people living on Oahu. Here's Captain Michael McGinnis. He's the Pacific Fleet's surgeon commander. And here he is talking about how that drinking water contamination was discovered.
Our medical teams have screened over 5,900 patients during this event. The vast majority were conducted within the first 2 weeks of our response. Patients' symptoms were consistent with an acute environmental exposure event. Patients' symptoms consistent with the following: nausea, vomiting, headache, diarrhea, skin or eye irritation. Once patients were removed from the water source, the symptoms rapidly resolved.
And as of March 9th, there are 12 zones near Pearl Harbor that are still under a health advisory, and those people are not allowed to use their water for drinking, cooking, or brushing their teeth. Like, just imagine not having clean water in your home since Thanksgiving. And so how did this happen? Here's Rear Admiral Blake Converse.
Our best information is that this recent spill was due to operator error.
And just to be clear,
I want to start by saying that the Navy caused this problem. We own it, and we're going to fix it.
But the Red Hill facility's problems are beyond one person screwing up and one spill. So here's Representative Ka'ali'i Kahalehi of Hawaii. Here he is talking to Rear Admiral Peter Stamatopoulos of the United States Navy.
Tanks number 3, number 4, and number 11 have not been inspected for approximately 40 years. So my question to NAVSUP is, or Navy Supply Systems Command, is why are these tanks still in operation? And how can you assure this committee and the people of Hawaii that tanks 3, 4, and 11 that have not even been looked at in the last 40 years are safe to use and meet current API 653 guidelines for bulk fuel storage underground facilities?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Yes, you are correct. There are tanks, as you mentioned, that have been out of periodicity for quite a long time.
And on top of that, here's the Rear Admiral answering a question posed by Representative Jackie Spear of California.
Are the commanding officers and or executive officers that are assigned to Red Hill trained in petroleum management?
I'll take that question, ma'am. The answer is no.
Oh, wonderful. So the old ass infrastructure is not being inspected nearly enough, like ever in my lifetime. So self-regulation isn't working in the military. Who would have thought? And the people in charge are not experts in managing the thing that they are responsible for managing. Not great. And this is not the first time that these naval band of geniuses have fucked up at Red Hill. So in 2014, apparently 27,000 gallons of jet fuel spilled from a tank, which is when the Hawaii residents collectively got worried about the threat to the drinking water. Because I can tell you that I lived there for 2.5 years, from 2008 until the end of 2010, and I had no idea this existed. I didn't hear about this really until Thanksgiving. So that was in 2014 when I think a lot of people on the island were first notified that, like, oh, this thing exists. Then in March of 2020, so the same time that COVID was popping, 7,700 gallons spilled, but no one knew about it because the Navy didn't tell anyone until a sheen was spotted on the ocean months later in June. Then on May 6, 2021, there was another operator error spill that we still don't really know the size of. But what happened is that the operator did not close the pipeline valves in the right order before starting to move the fuel around in the pipes, and it came out of the pipes. Now, the Navy says that it didn't contaminate the drinking water, but that's a sentence that we now know we can't trust from the Defense Department. Because the next time they said the drinking water was fine, thousands of people got sick when this big spill happened. Because the spill happened on November 20th or 21st, and it wasn't until November 29th that the Navy acknowledged that the drinking water was unsafe. And by that time, people were already sick with jet fuel poisoning at the hospitals. But here's the good news. Unless something really unexpected happens, this is likely to be the last spill from Red Hill. Because on December 6th, the state of Hawaii ordered the U.S. Navy to halt operations at the Red Hill facility. Now, the Navy fought that order in court, but the courts sided with all the poisoned people, which is pretty nice of them to do. And then on March 7th, just last week, the Department of Defense announced that they will permanently close the Red Hill facility and will disperse the fuel storage around the Indo-Pacific region. And so what the dingleberry to the CR number 3 provides is that it allows the Department of Defense to spend their operations and maintenance money to respond to the spill. They are allowed to spend $53 million for the response from that account. Then on top of that, they're going to get an extra $250 million added onto their budget for 2022 to fix the drinking water contamination. And then they'll get another $100 million on top of that so that they can comply with the Hawaii state order to remove the fuel from the Red Hill facility. That's a lot of money, and they're probably going to need more, but at least that money is going towards actually fixing the problem. Now, this story really got to me, I think, for obvious reasons, because I'm personally connected to the community that got poisoned. Like, I drank Honolulu water from the summer of 2008 all the way through 2010, 2.5 years. Now, I did look into it, and I think that I'm fine because Waikiki is where the evacuees went, and that's where I lived. And so I don't think at any point I was drinking the Red Hill water. And the first big spill, at least that we know of, was a few years after I left. But I know people that lived in the spill zone. In fact, I still might know them. I'm not sure where everyone lives now, but I don't want anyone that I know or love drinking water with poisons in it. And so it just hits harder when people you personally know are put in danger. And, with just a few different life choices, I could have been in one of those poisoned homes, So it's just it just hits closer. But the thing is, the more I thought about it, is I think most of us do know what it's like in America to worry about drinking water, or at least we should, because I'm finding out through this job just how dangerous drinking water is so often in America in general. We really have let our infrastructure go to shit, and we're not inspecting it nearly enough, clearly. And we generally don't fix problems anymore using the federal government. Everything, it seems, is geared towards expanding the private sector here. And so as a result, our public sector has just fallen apart. We have lead in pipes that still haven't been fully replaced in Flint, in Michigan. And how long did we find out about that? 5-7 years ago, something like that? And the thing is, lead poisoning in our drinking water, it didn't just happen in Flint. Here's a title from a report from the National Resources Defense Council that just kind of tells you everything you need to know. Quote, lead pipes are widespread and used in every state, unquote. Then there's fracking and other fossil fuel operations that poison our water all the time in California, Texas, Colorado, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. Those are just the states off the top of my head, but this is well known. And every time I research a spill, literally every time going back a decade now, I'm always at a minimum disappointed and too often horrified by how hands-off our safety police are with the companies that cause water poisonings. And now apparently the military too. But in Hawaii, seeing every day, looking at the mountains there, just watching how much rain falls and knowing how much the residents care about the island and the environment, I just thought I was safer there. I didn't really look into it. I just assumed. But I feel like that's an assumption that we should all be able to make in a functional society. We should be able to assume that our drinking water is clean. And so, ignorant or not, I felt safe in Hawaii. It never occurred to me to check and see if the Navy was storing jet fuel in tanks the size of buildings inside of a dormant volcano sitting over our drinking water. Silly me! And I didn't ask if those tanks that I didn't know existed were inspected more often than once every 40 years. This thing was personally threatening my health the whole time I lived there, and I had no idea. And that's really haunting me and making me think a lot about the threats that we all face from the lack of investment in our public sector over the course of my life. Obviously, there's all these examples of poisoning of our drinking water, but we also know that our air quality is not amazing, especially near places that burn fossil fuels, of which we have a lot of in the #1 fossil fuel producing United States of America. We also know that our bridges are just falling down. And then I just got back from Europe, and I have to make the comparison that just walking around is safer there. In most places, there is very little walking and biking infrastructure that make it safe for us to get around and not have to dodge cars that just seem to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more dangerous to pedestrians. And then there's our healthcare system, so that when you do get run over by one of these giant fucking trucks, you go into our healthcare system, and we learned through this whole COVID experience just how little wiggle room we have when it comes to capacity in our system. We had to shut down our society because we didn't have enough beds. I feel danger here because our public system has been so neglected. And so big picture, we're not okay here in the United States. And we're not going to be okay until we collectively start valuing and investing in our public sector again. But in Hawaii, at least this one threat is being eliminated. We are solving one problem. the Red Hill jet fuel storage mountain is going to close. And the way that it happened is that Hawaii state representatives, they legislated it. The public loudly supported those demands. And the Navy confirmed this week that they have to close Red Hill down because they were forced to by the people. Now, it's a small step in the grand scheme of things to end this one poisonous danger on one Hawaiian island, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And now we have an example to look to when we need to fix another problem and another problem. And so we can just, one problem by one problem, start chipping away at these dangers to our communities. We can look at the political recipe that just worked in Hawaii and do it again. And so I do appreciate not only the fact that this one threat is being eliminated, but I appreciate having a page in the how to fix things using government playbook. We have a new page to look at. Now, I just wish that we didn't have to spend hundreds of millions of tax dollars and poison people to get that page written. And hopefully the water will be clean soon. But it is great to know that this can never happen again. Okay, so I've been sitting here racking my brain, and I really can't think of a good segue for this. So let's just move on to the next thing that became law that has to do with that Puerto Rican junta, the oversight board. Because Congress has finally fixed a gaping corruption loophole in the law that created the junta in Puerto Rico, the law which is also known as PROMESA, and it created the officially titled Fiscal Oversight Board. Now, quick backstory here, for those of you who haven't heard the Puerto Rico episodes, which I put in the show notes for you. But like many places in the United States, after the United States and the World Trade System integrated countries with virtually no labor laws protecting workers or requiring minimum wages, companies that were operating in the United States, specifically in this case in Puerto Rico, moved their manufacturing to China, Mexico, and other countries so that they could pay their workers less and pocket their wages that they used to pay Americans as profit. Well, when that happened, lots of Puerto Ricans found themselves without jobs when the companies moved away, and the government of the island took in much less in income taxes because of it. And so to raise quick cash, government officials in Puerto Rico took out loans from banks with super high interest rates. And by the time the Obama administration came around, Puerto Rico had racked up tens of billions of dollars in debt. To deal with it, Congress passed and Obama signed the PROMESA law, which created a fiscal oversight board to take over Puerto Rico's finances and figure out who would get paid back by Puerto Rico, how much they would get paid back, and determine how Puerto Rico would pay them. Now, I've considered the board to be a scandal since the beginning, an opinion shared by many people in Puerto Rico, which I can say confidently because I have visited the island twice since the oversight board was created. I produced an episode each time I went, and again, those are waiting for you in the show notes. But basically, the board was staffed by members of Congress and Barack Obama. The people of Puerto Rico had no role in selecting their new overlords, and the members of Congress trusted with staffing the board stuffed the board full of bankers. And so, for example, in a weird connection to what's happening right now, the person put in charge of the board, who remains there until this day, is Natalie Jaresko. She's a Ukrainian investment banker who held several positions at the U.S. State Department and who was appointed Ukraine's Minister of Finance after Ukraine's government got regime changed in 2014. After she left that job, assimilating Ukraine into the World Trade Economic System and arranging for Ukraine to take out a $40 billion loan from the IMF loan shark, Natalie Jaresko moved over to Puerto Rico, where she became a former banker in charge of determining if and how much bankers who charged obscenely high interest rates would get paid by the Puerto Rican people. Along with her on the oversight board were two former executives from Spanish bank Santander, two guys who were at the head of the bank when it issued most of its high interest loans to Puerto Rico. And then they were put in a position to see how much the banks that they worked for would get paid. So just conflicts of interest with this board, they have been blatant and scandalous since the beginning. But in the years since the board has been controlling Puerto Rico's finances, there have been concerns about conflicts of interest, not just with the people on the board itself, but also with the contractors, the private companies that the oversight board has been paying with Puerto Rico's money to help it divide up and pay out Puerto Rico's money. Now, the story that seems to have awakened Congress to the problem broke in 2019, when news reports documented how McKinsey & Company, which is a very powerful DC consulting firm, was advising Puerto Rico on the island's debt restructuring at the same exact time that it held bonds issued by Puerto Rico. So essentially, the concern was that McKinsey was helping the board decide to pay and how much, while a division of their company was waiting in line to be paid. Now, an investigation concluded that McKinsey made the disclosures that were required by the oversight board and by law. So McKinsey technically did nothing wrong, but that's the problem. They didn't have to disclose their conflict of interest, and so they didn't. And so the fix here is pretty obvious. They should be required to disclose that. And just to be clear, the investigation also found that there was enough separation between McKinsey and the subsidiary that Puerto Rico owed money that there was actually no scandal. But the fact that the law was followed and that investment remained unknown, that just exhibited a big red flag that there were holes in the disclosure laws that applied to Puerto Rico. And so, to explain to you what Congress did and why, here is a montage of members of the House of Representatives from February 23rd, which was the day the bill passed the House. All of these people were speaking on the House floor. And in this order, you're going to hear Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, then Representative Nadia Velázquez of New York, who has been a very strong advocate for Puerto Rico the entire time that I've been paying attention. You'll also hear from Representative Dan Bishop of North Carolina. Then you'll hear Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, and I call her Resident Commissioner because Puerto Rico is actually not represented in Congress the same way the rest of us are. They don't get a full Congress member with full voting rights. They get a resident commissioner instead, which is a whole other scandal that we need to deal with. Then you'll hear from Dan Bishop again, and then back to Nadia Velázquez. But here you go. Here's what they did with the new law.
In response to dire fiscal issues facing Puerto Rico at the time, Congress passed the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESCA, in 2016. That legislation established the Financial Oversight and Management Board with control over Puerto Rico's budget, laws, financial plans, and regulations, and the authority to retain professionals to assist the board in executing its responsibilities.
The Puerto Rico Recovery, Accuracy, and Disclosures Act of 2021, or PRADA, eliminates a double standard currently facing Puerto Rico. Under U.S. Code and federal bankruptcy procedure, any conflicts of interest or even the perception of such conflict between those working on the bankruptcy and the debtor are required to be disclosed. However, a loophole in the current law prevents this requirement from being extended to the people of Puerto Rico.
Most significantly, the gap in the 2016 law created a potential for undisclosed compensation terms and undiscovered conflicts of interest vis-a-vis parties in interest for professionals serving in Puerto Rico's bankruptcy.
Learning that someone was involved in businesses of one of the parties in the case only after they are named and working on the case does not create assurance of their commitment to the best interest of Puerto Rico or even managing the debt.
This bill's disclosure and oversight requirements increase the likelihood that conflicts of interest will be caught and timely addressed before compensation decisions are made.
While we can have different opinions on how effectively the Oversight Board is carrying out its mission, one thing should be clear: the island's residents should be entitled to the same rights and protections of any debtor on the mainland.
And so what the new law does is it basically requires that anyone hired by the Oversight Board file a disclosure about their conflicts of interest. And if they don't do so, then they can't get paid. Also, if they are found to not be a, quote, disinterested person, unquote, or if they have an adverse interest that is a conflict of interest, then that person is also disqualified from being paid. This passed the House 429-0, and it was passed unanimously in the Senate. And so while the board still exists, and it's going to continue to exist until the budget of Puerto Rico has been balanced for 4 years, at least this small fix was made. And I was wondering This fix seems so obvious. What took so damn long? Well, it turns out that whatever the holdup was, it wasn't for lack of trying by the few members of Congress who have proven that they care deeply for Puerto Rico. So here's Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon talking on the House floor.
Representative Velasquez and myself have proposed this bipartisan initiative in the last two Congresses, having achieved passage in the House during the last session.
So they've been trying for years. Better late than never, I guess. Okay, so finally, one more law that I think you should know about is one that grants you new rights, specifically to tell corporations to fuck off with their forced arbitration clauses, at least in some instances. Arbitration clauses are parts of contracts often found in the fine print that we thoughtlessly sign all the time with companies that say that if the company screws us over in some way and we want to sue them, we legally agree in the fine print to sue them in an arbitration court instead of a real court, the kind with, a jury of our peers. Arbitration clauses are in all kinds of contracts. When you sign up for a credit card or a bank account or buy a car or click that you agree to the terms of service for an Uber ride, chances are that you have agreed to settle any grievances you have with the company via arbitration. These clauses are everywhere. I just found one in my Panda Express app. And so as a customer, it's almost guaranteed that you've legally agreed to probably many arbitration clauses. You'd kind of have to be a hermit who only uses cash and has no tech whatsoever to avoid them. There's also a good chance that if you, unlike me, are actually employable, especially by a large company, there's a good chance that you've signed an arbitration clause in your employment contract. These kinds of arbitration clauses are referred to often as forced arbitration because they're included in contracts that you pretty much have to sign. Like, what's your alternative? Not take the job? Not have a bank account? Negotiate a personalized contract with Panda Express? The reality is that if you want, or more importantly, need something like a job that requires you to sign a contract, you as an individual are kind of powerless in that negotiation. The choice is that you sign it and get what you need, or you don't, and you're fucked. And it wasn't always like this, with individuals matched up against companies as if they're negotiating with equal power. The arbitration system was set up originally so that businesses of equal size could settle disputes with each other. Here's Miriam Giles. She is the professor of law at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. And in this clip that you're going to hear from a hearing that took place in the House Judiciary Committee on November 16th of last year, she's going to refer to the FAA, which is the Federal Arbitration Act, which is the law that allowed the arbitration system to exist and have its judgments be honored by the real courts.
The FAA was enacted in 1925, but it was enacted so that sophisticated business people could negotiate for arbitration provisions, and those provisions would be respected by courts. It was never intended to be imposed via standard form contract. And in fact, if you read the legislative history, if you read the legislation, it accepts and exempts employees. So the idea that the FAA applies to employees is something that was created by a conservative majority of the Supreme Court in 1991 in a case called Circuit City. First actually was Gilmer and then Circuit City. I can't keep all the bad cases straight. And those are the cases in which the court interpreted, I would say misinterpreted the FAA to apply to employees like this. So that now employers can just stick these clauses into job applications, orientation materials, even an innocuous email from HR can include a forced arbitration clause. That was not what the 1925 Congress intended. They should be rolling in their graves. This is not what they intended. This is what a Supreme Court intent on protecting corporations intended beginning in the 1990s.
And another witness in the hearing, Deepak Gupta, who's a law professor who used to work at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, he seemed to share her interpretation of the situation.
I've gone back and looked at the history of the act from 1925. People weren't blind to the possibility of abuse. They raised these concerns before this committee, in fact. And the architects of the legislation were clear. This is about letting businesses of equal bargaining power that want to resolve their disputes out of court, letting them do that. And I have no objection to that. That makes perfect sense. But the drafters were clear. This is not about foisting this on people who don't consent through take it or leave it contracts. And in fact, Congress put in a provision, Section 1 of the Federal Arbitration Act, that says this shall not apply to any class of workers. Remarkably, the Supreme Court has read that language to mean precisely the opposite, and now it can apply to any class of workers. And so we've strayed so far away from what Congress intended in 1925, and that's why only this body, Congress, can set things right.
And he's right, we have strayed so far, because despite the original law specifically saying that these arbitration clauses should not be applied to workers, a recent report estimated that about 56.2% of non-union employees, or about 60 million Americans, are subject to mandatory arbitration agreements in their employment contracts. That's a lot of us. Here's Miriam Giles again explaining why we should be concerned about arbitration clauses hidden in our contracts.
When an arbitration complaint is filed in secret. In other words, the only entities that know that the arbitration has even been filed are the employer, the complaining employee, and the arbitration entity, the AAA or JAMS or one of these arbitration providers. Nobody else knows. Contrast that with court. If I go down to the D.C. District Court today and I file a complaint, that complaint is on the public record. Right? And so is the defendant's answer or motion to dismiss. All the pleadings, they're public. Litigation in the public court system, it has power. And the power it has is the power of signaling, not only to the defendant that I've sued, but to all similarly situated defendants that this is a wrong. This person has complained about something. She's told her story and she plans to prove it. None of that happens in arbitration. From the beginning, it is private throughout the entire proceeding, which is held in a secret location, no public, no press. All of it is private. Arbitrators don't write decisions. There are only 3 states in the union that currently require minimal disclosure of arbitrations. Pretty redacted and hard to read if you're a researcher like I am about these issues. Other than that, everything that happens in arbitration is a black box.
And here's a real-world example of how that affects someone who has been harmed by an employer. In this case, former Fox News commentator Gretchen Carlson, who was sexually harassed by her boss while working at Fox News. Here she is testifying to Congress in May of 2019 about her experience with pursuing a sexual assault case that was governed by a forced arbitration clause in her Fox News employment contract.
Arbitration means that you have no way of knowing that anyone else is facing the same thing within the confines of the workplace structure. There's no way to know because the whole process is secret. And as I described during my testimony, if you do muster up the courage to go and complain and you have an arbitration clause, that's a good day for the company because no one will ever know anything about your story. The worst ramification of all of this is that the perpetrator gets to stay in the job. And I think one of the reasons that we've seen this cultural revolution that we're experiencing right now is because the American public was actually so angry about hearing about these stories. And they were wondering, why didn't we know about this? And the reason they didn't know about it is because of forced arbitration.
On top of that, the arbitration system itself is structured in a way that has limited power to change companies. In fact, it's disincentivized from even trying. Here's Miriam Giles again.
As a corollary, and this is an important corollary, the relief that is available to the individual claimant doesn't prevent the wrongdoer from preying on other women, doesn't prevent the predator from having all sorts of misconduct against other women in the workplace. The proceedings are one-on-one, and the relief that arbitrators are allowed by contract to grant is individualized. They can't ever order any changes beyond what can help this one individual that happens to have the courage to come before them. I mean, can you imagine a worse system for dealing with toxic corporate culture? Because I can't. Third, and I think this is really important, and all the survivors have spoken about this, forced arbitration is a system where the employers write the rules and they pick the arbitral provider, which means that victims of sexual harassment are shunted into a regime that's stacked against them from the get-go. First, because the arbitrator's economic interest is to be very good to the repeat player employer so that they can be chosen for another arbitration next time. So the repeat player problem has been well documented, and I think it's alive and well in arbitration, and the secrecy protects that. And second, because the employer designs the entire arbitration process, it does so to serve its interests, not the interests of its workers, but its interests, which again are to keep discrimination and harassment under a veil of secrecy and out of the public eye. So given all of these things, given how bad this system is for victims of sexual harassment, it's no wonder that so few ever decide to go into private arbitration. I wouldn't. I think it sounds terrible.
And because of the employment contracts, if a victim of sexual assault chooses not to go to private arbitration, that means in effect that they're left with only the option to just let it go because going to the real courts aren't legally an option for them. And members of Congress, and to be accurate here, members of the Democratic Party in Congress mainly don't consider that to be a fair choice. They consider that really no choice at all. Here's Representative Jerry Nadler of New York.
We used to have a concept in law, when I went to law school, they still taught it, called contracts of adhesion, where a contract was unenforceable if one party had no choice in entering into it. All of these arbitration clauses almost are contracts of adhesion. You try, when you want to get a credit card, try crossing out the fine print, if you can find it without the magnifying glass, that says that you will settle all disputes in arbitration. Cross it out, see if you get the credit card. See if you get the bank loan. See if you get the mortgage. See if you get the car loan. You have no choice.
See if you get the job. See if you get the paycheck. Realistically, it's not a choice. Not when these clauses are in as many contracts as they are. They're impossible to avoid and be a functioning member of this society. But some Republicans in Congress didn't agree, especially this lady. Here she is in a hearing in the Judiciary Committee on November 16th, but she also showed up on the House floor the day of the debate to argue against the bill too. She seemed pretty passionate about it. I'm talking about Representative Michelle Fischbach of Minnesota.
And I would argue that you sign it. It is not, even though we use it's forced arbitration, as people are saying, it's not really, you have signed something that you have agreed to it.
You signed to it. You agreed. It's your fault for not reading the fine print, lazy. Even though everyone knows that the reality of the situation is that no one reads all, 100 pages of their employment contract on the first day of a job. No one reads the booklet in font 2 size at the bank when opening an account. No one reads the terms of service on the app when ordering Chinese junk food. But so many Republicans just ignored that reality, acting as if we're all irresponsible for those perfectly understandable and normal behaviors. Terms of service are long and in small font and in legalese for a reason. Arbitration clauses are buried in the middle of the long, small, hard to understand texts for a reason. And Republicans in general seem to be just fine with that. And what was just as frustrating as their arguments in the multiple hearings and House floor debates that I watched was that the Republicans also just kept straight up lying about what the bill they were working on would actually do. They and the witnesses they invited repeatedly framed the issue as if what the Democrats were trying to do was to kill the arbitration system entirely. So here's Representative James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin.
You'll hear a different view from me. Eliminating arbitration achieves one thing. It enriches trial attorneys.
Here's one of the witnesses that the Republicans called. Her name is Sarah Parshall Perry, and she was from the Heritage Foundation, because of course.
Arbitration agreements are not mandatory. No one, and the Supreme Court has held, is forced to sign a contract. But curtailing access to arbitration would injure, in the end, the very people that Congress has sought for nearly a century to protect.
Here's the other Republican witness, Anna St. John. She's the president and general counsel of the Hamilton Lincoln Law Institute.
Instead, it's worth considering that taking away the possibility of arbitration for these victims is a top-down, heavy-handed approach that denies them the advantages of arbitration as a means of adjudicating their claims.
And here's Representative Daryl Issa of California, who was fired by his district a few years ago and is somehow back in Congress again. And here he is bullying a victim, Tatiana Spotswood, a law student at the Columbia Law School, who was testifying to Congress about her experience of being violently raped by her boss, who then used a forced arbitration clause in her contract to sue her and keep it secret.
And the forced arbitration is so unfair.
So I understand you think forced arbitration is unfair. That's great. Most of the people on that side want to eliminate it for everything, not just situations.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I will not.
He's such a dick. But here's the thing. All of them claiming that, the Democrats are trying to get rid of arbitration and make it impossible to access. The bill does nothing of the sort. In fact, I haven't seen any bills authored by any Democrats that would eliminate the arbitration system from existence. No one in Congress is trying to do that I'm aware of. What is being attempted is to make the arbitration system fully intact for those that want to use it, not have it forced upon individuals by companies with more money and power. Want is the key word here. This is all about choosing the system, a real choice as life exists in the real world, not in the Republican fantasy land where everyone reads every line of every contract and has the power to negotiate out clauses that limit their rights to the court system, a constitutionally protected right to access the court system. The lack of choice for the less powerful party is the issue here. But I think they actually know that, which is why I framed those comments as lies. Because eventually the Republicans did voice what I think are their real concerns. Here's Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio speaking on the House floor the day that the bill was passed.
We know that if parties can't agree in advance to arbitrate, then they are unlikely to agree to arbitrate after there's been a dispute. As a result, the plaintiff may never get to arbitration.
So they know that given the choice, many victims will not choose arbitration. Many victims will choose the real courts, which takes away the secrecy shields and takes the power to choose the judges away from the corporations. And Michelle Fischbach, she also let her corporate power concerns fly as well. Here she is in the hearing that took place in November in the Judiciary Committee.
What's happened to so many women and others in the workplace is terrible, but I really am concerned that by involving the government in these contracts between adults in the area of sexual harassment and assault, we're opening a door for more government involvement in other areas of contracts.
Once again, Republicans are showing that they are the party of corporate rule. They are protecting the corporation's rights or assumed rights to choose who will judge their law breaking, and they are protecting corporate contracts. They are more concerned and are governing for corporate rights than they are for customer and worker rights. And the debate on this bill made that crystal clear. But the Republicans lost this battle. And so now H.R. 445, the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act of 2021, became law. This is a law that protects an individual's right to choose which court to use for some victims of corporate crime. What the law specifically does is it invalidates pre-dispute arbitration clauses in contracts if the person alleging sexual harassment or sexual assault wants to go to court instead of arbitration. If that is the case, then they can take their case to federal, state, or tribal courts. Also, the decision about where the case will be heard will be made by a real court, not the arbitrators picked by the company, regardless of what the contract may say. And I noticed that this isn't just for employees. If you are sexually assaulted or harassed in a situation where you are the customer somewhere, so if you're on an airline or in an Uber, I don't know, but anywhere where you click, I agree on the terms of service, this nullifies that part of their fine print as well. I personally, as someone who works and is a customer, that's what I identify as, I consider this a really good bill and I'm happy that it's law. But the Republicans were not on my side on this. And I say that because 97 of them voted against this bill in the House. In the Senate, they didn't take a recorded vote at all, but at least none of the Republicans there were actively stopping the bill from moving forward, even though they were protected from having to actually cast a vote. But if there was opposition to this, and it was 100% from Republican lawmakers. And since it is an election year, I do think this is worth knowing. And so here's Republican Representative Michelle Fischbach again of Minnesota, this time from the House floor the day this bill was debated.
Why are some in Congress so intent on taking this legislation forward today? For years, Democrats have tried to gut arbitration agreements for all kinds of different claims and plaintiffs. If Democrats had their way, everyone, from consumers to civil rights plaintiffs to those with antitrust claims to individuals using financial service products and other, would not be able to contract in advance to resolve disputes through arbitration.
You say that like it's a bad thing. In this debate, judging by party, it was clear who was representing my interests and who wasn't. And so now you can use this information for your voting preferences in November, however you wish. And November's coming up pretty fast. I think you can probably tell from my attitude today that I'm not in the best headspace. I am extremely frustrated with Congress, with the state of the world. The Ukraine war is obviously really getting to me, and everything just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And when I look at what can we do about it, I still come back to why I started this podcast to begin with, which is that we get to vote out everyone in the House of Representatives every 2 years. That is an opportunity we get every 2 years to change who gets to make our laws, specifically in the House where they control the money. It's an enormous amount of power that we have that we haven't used. And the only way that I can see this idea going forward and actually happening is if Americans pay more attention to Congress. And producing this podcast is my attempt to make it easier to judge people's job performances, but it's not going to make a difference if we still have a small audience size forever. And so I've been giving it a lot of thought because, lately I've been really having this conversation with you about, funding Congressional Dish and, about the value for value funding model. I'm not accepting advertisers because I don't want corporate influence to be in this podcast. There is going to be an advertising free space in this world, and I'm creating one. So that's really important to me. But I also know that money is super tight right now. I know that inflation is very real. I was born in 1982, and apparently the inflation rate has not been this high since I was born. There's been a firings wave on Patreon, which I was expecting because of the controversial nature of the Ukraine episode. And that did happen. I did get fired by some people, although I also got a lot of support. And I want to thank everyone that sent in financial and moral support for that episode. You are giving me the balls I need to produce an episode like that again, if the situation requires it in the future. So thank you to everyone who supported that episode. But there were some firings for that, but there have been more firings lately because of people's financial situations. Because when people fire me on Patreon, there is a questionnaire that gets filled out at the end, and I can see what that is. And just one person after another, it's been financial situation changed. And then some people also left really nice notes, and in those notes, they explained the firing. So we had one producer who lost his or her job. We had someone whose wages were cut. We've had a health crisis in the community. And so to all of you, I completely understand. Please take care of yourselves. I know that you will settle up when you're better. This is why I do the funding for this podcast the way that I do. I want to make sure that the important episodes are free for everyone because money is tight, and I get that, and I empathize with that. And so I do have a proposal for people that don't want to feel like freeloaders, who do want to be a part of this team and want to participate in, the mission of getting people to pay attention to Congress so that maybe someday we won't hire back 90%, 96% of the people who are doing such a terrible job managing our country. I know that people want to be on board this and that it's too expensive for some people, especially right now. And so here's my proposal. if you truly can't pay for Congressional Dish right now, I will consider us even if you can get one confirmed new listener per episode. I feel like that could be fair. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. So like, you know, if you have a larger social media following on one platform or another, you could post the episode and then ask people to comment, because people probably won't comment on it if they haven't listened to it. So that's how you can confirm the listen. If you're going on a car ride with someone, we're getting into the nicer weather now. Spring is right around the corner. And you can go for a car ride and suggest that you listen to an episode of Congressional Dish. Pick one of your favorites that you think the people in the car would be interested in and force them to listen to it while you're driving. I don't know, get creative. That's really up to you. But I do think that expanding the reach of this podcast is a way that you can return the value that you receive. And that is something that I feel like would be fair and really does help with the mission that I have here, which is to get more people to be aware of what happens in Congress and how it affects us, and to be aware of the actual job performance of Congress so that we can take more responsibility for our districts and hopefully elect better people to represent us, because it can't continue like this. It just can't continue like this. I hate the feeling that when I came back from Portugal, I feel like I'm coming home to a dysfunctional, somewhat dangerous place. And the reason that I feel that way is that our public sector has been just so neglected for so long, and the corruption runs so deep here. And I'm depressed, honestly. And it needs to get better. It needs to get better. And I just don't see how it gets any better if we keep electing these people over and over and over again. And so, yeah, if we can just spread the word about what's really going on in Congress and spread the word that we need to pay attention to Congress, I think that is the first step towards starting to fix our problems. So thank you to those of you who do pay for this podcast. I was able to produce 2 episodes per month the entire time I was in Europe. In fact, I've been doing it since Thanksgiving. And it didn't kill me, which was really cool. I was able to live my new digital nomad life, and work didn't destroy me. And I still was able to enjoy being in Europe. And the main reason for that is because you are paying for the show, which has allowed me to build an amazing team who has helped me produce this. So thank you to Mike and Daryl at Pro Podcast Solutions. Thank you, Claire, who is an amazing assistant. I absolutely love having her on the team. Thank you, Emma, who is making the YouTube videos with segments of Congressional Dish that you want to share. So you can find those on our YouTube page at congressionaldish.tv. And if you have some requests, please send us the timestamps of the clips that you want to share, and Emma can make short videos of those. We're more likely to do this for producers than for people that have, never been heard of before. But if you do have a clip that you think could stand on its own and would be worth our time and money, please let us know. There's a whole back catalog of Congressional Dish episodes, and we're definitely interested in knowing what you think are the best pieces. Also, thank you, Brian, who's been doing the artwork forever. Thank you, Chaz, who's running our Instagram account at Congressional Dish. Thank you, Mark, who's keeping my website from being taken down by, random ass internet trolls. And thank you to my sister, Lauren, who does my accounting. And without her, I would have absolutely no idea if I could afford to pay any of these people. So, thank you for making this team possible and for making this podcast possible. And I'm really grateful to have this job, but I also need a break. Because like I said, I'm just, and I don't feel like I'm alone in this, but I feel like we have lost total control of our government. I kind of mentioned before that it's really jarring to the system to come from Portugal. When I got to Portugal, they were under a lockdown, and then they came out of it. And I just felt so safe there. It's so easy to get a COVID test there. The wearing of masks is so uncontroversial there. I just felt safe there. And I just felt like the decisions there, they made sense. And here I come back to the United States, and kind of out of nowhere, it's just like no masks are needed anywhere anymore. And the decisions feel so politically motivated and so random. I don't trust them, which is so disappointing, because even though I I distrusted Joe Biden. I desperately did not want him to be the Democratic nominee for the presidency, mainly because of Ukraine. You know, like that was one of my main concerns. And here we are at war in Ukraine. But I voted for Joe Biden thinking he'd be more responsible when it came to the pandemic. And now I don't trust the CDC with the people that he's put in charge. I think decisions are politically motivated. I'm super depressed about it. I also see this like battle of economic systems. What the Biden administration has decided to do is to make the entire population of Russia suffer for the actions of someone we keep calling a dictator. Like, I just can't get over the fact that in 2003, we overthrew a country that was not our next door neighbor, that was not training with hostile powers the way Ukraine was militarily. We went to Iraq, a place that could not possibly physically threaten us. And we overthrew that government, and we did not get punished as American citizens for what George W. Bush did. We didn't have the entire world shut down our economy. I mean, maybe that would be fair. If you think what's happening to the people of Russia is fair, then it would be fair for us to have been crippled economically for what we did in 2003. But that's not what happened. And yet that's what we're doing to the Russian citizens. Like, we're trying to make it hard for them to get resources and information and money. And we're making whole populations suffer. And for what, right? Like, for this battle of economic systems. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, there is a short video of me explaining what I think is the big picture issue going on in foreign policy, which is we are the muscle trying to get the entire world to be a part of what I have nicknamed the World Trade System. It's administered via the World Trade Organization. The IMF is the loan shark that, you know, basically gives countries money and requires them to change their economic laws in return for that money. There's also the World Bank, which is all up in this. Like, just call all of that the World Trade System. And the expansion of the World Trade System is why we orchestrated the coup in 2014 in Ukraine. And when you look at our response to what's happening in Ukraine, it is an economic system response. And it's really interesting watching all of this happen. If I can separate myself in these moments from the horror of the situation, like these poor Ukrainians, I just feel like I feel responsible for what's happening to them, and it breaks my heart every time I think about it. But I look at the response that we have, these crippling sanctions. And so instead of us trying to pressure Russia to assimilate, we're really now saying, like, okay, you don't want to be a part of the World Trade System. Now let's see what it's like for you to be cut off from it completely. And I think the consequences of this are unknown. It's one of the reasons that I'm not really talking too much on Twitter or on social media, because I don't know what conclusions to draw from this. I think it's way too early. I'm just kind of sitting back and watching and seeing how this is unfolding. I feel like this just isn't a time for talking. It's a time for watching, for observing, for learning. So that's kind of what I'm doing with this situation. But what I just keep looking at, it's like you look at Vladimir Putin bombing Ukraine like this for goals that they're still fuzzy. We still don't know if we can trust what he says. Like, is Moldova going to be next? Like, we don't know. We don't really know what the goals are. And you look at Joe Biden, and just there's these handful of these elites that are making these decisions that are so consequential for those of us that are just trying to live our lives. You know, Ukrainian people that were 3 weeks ago living like the rest of us have now had to flee the country, and their homes have exploded, and so many people are dying. And then in Russia, are they going to be able to get access to food? They were going home from work, and their transportation systems they couldn't access their subways because they were cut off from Google and Apple Pay. These people that own businesses, they might be owning a cupcake store somewhere in Russia, and now all of a sudden they can't take credit card payments. Like, the games of the elites are affecting people in such serious ways. And I just keep sitting here going like, who the f do these people think they are? And why do they keep getting away with it? I just feel like these elites in this world are getting more and more brazen all the time, and they never go to jail and they don't lose their jobs. In the case of Joe Biden, we promoted him to president of the United States, and I'm sitting here and I just don't know what to do. There's so many problems that there are solutions for. And sitting here documenting them for a living, I do think that's important because you need to have the list, right? Like you need to have the list of the problems to know what to solve. You need to know where there are problems in the law in order to pressure your lawmakers to change them. And so I think documenting this, I think it's important and I want to keep doing it. But then documenting this year after year after year and watching these people keep getting rehired, and here comes November and I just get this feeling that we're going to fucking do it again. And I just feel like right now I'm just constantly suppressing a scream. And I need to regroup. I need to calm down so that I can get back to reading the second half of the infrastructure law that I still haven't finished. And now I have all of these stories that I'm sure are buried in those 1,000 pages of the government funding law. You know, I believe strongly that we need to know what the problems are in order to fix them, should we ever choose to value our government. But I need a break. So this is going to be the only episode in March. I will be back in April. And the thing is that I've actually had this break scheduled for a long time. And that's another thing that I'm really frustrated with, because I am really struggling to plan a life around a fully dysfunctional Congress. Like, the government funding was supposed to be done almost 6 months ago. So in theory, I should be done reading that law by now. And even with infrastructure, like, I should have had plenty of time. And now I have this massive pile on my desk while my 40th birthday is upon me. I turned 40 on March 26th. And so I've had a cruise booked for a really long time. And honestly, when it comes to the podcast, it's not the best time for this, I know, because we do have this law that just dropped, and I know we're all really interested in knowing what's in the government funding, and yet I can't reschedule the cruise, you know? And I also feel like I really need to have a full week without internet access. I'm still obsessively watching the developments in Ukraine, and it's so sad, and I know it's not the most responsible thing in the world to check out for a week, but I need it. I need it. I need to get off social media. I need to not see the messages where people call me Putin's puppet and shit like that. I need a break from the bad news. And then when I get back, I turn 40 on the 26th. And then on the 29th, I need to go back to the Bay Area to have more skin cancer removed, this time from my face. And the thing is, it's not a dangerous kind of skin cancer. I'm not scared at all. I'm fine. But I'm, turning 40 and paying the consequences of when I was young and wanted a tan. And I love the feeling of being barbecued by the sun. But now I'm paying the price for it. And it's a very appropriate way of ringing in my 40s, I think. So the point is, that was a very long-winded and probably unnecessarily long way of telling you that I'm taking a break. And that I'll be back in April with an episode about something, because I don't even know where to begin to tackle the amount of pages now stacked on my digital desk. But I do think that also taking a break, I think some clarity will come with how to tackle this too. I'm just overwhelmed and tired and depressed with the state of the world. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So in the meantime, if you want to know what's going on in Congress, I do suggest that you check out Jamie Dupree. He's on Twitter, but he also has a Substack that's really good for daily updates on Congress. And then for the secrets in the omnibus, I can tell you when I get back from my break, I'm going to be checking out what the guys, David Moore and Donnie Shaw, have found over at Sludge, because I know that they are looking into this law, especially for anything that is related to congressional corruption and bribery and so-called campaign contributions. Like, Sludge is my go-to. So I suggest that you look at those two sources while I'm gone. And again, please support this show any way you can, because I obviously have a lot of work in front of me and I can use your help either by helping me grow the audience and the number of people paying attention to Congress, or by paying for the show. And speaking of paying for the show, I would also like to thank our executive producer. We have a new one. This one would also like to be anonymous. We have a lot of anonymous executive producers, which I'm perfectly fine with. But when you contribute $535, every time you do that, you are eligible for an executive producer credit on the episode of your choice, which are not only real credits, should you choose to want your actual name on there, but it also vouches for the episode where you put your credit. So for this one, the credit's going to go on episode number 76, Weapons for the World. And our new executive producer said, quote, "I would like an executive producer credit for episode 76, Weapons for the World, which pretty much predicted what is happening in Ukraine right now. Each statement I see on other media about how horrible Putin is, and he is horrible, lacks any reference to the decades of pressure our foreign policy has brought to bear, or the insane amount of money that our tax dollars have provided to destabilize and heavily arm that area. There are so many dire issues facing Americans, it is nearly impossible to stay focused on any one to resolve things. So I ask that you remind listeners that at the root of every issue, whether it is climate change, war, fossil fuels, healthcare, or countless others, is money in politics." Amen. That's my amen, not his. But back to the note, he says, Congress has a 15% approval rate and a 94% reelection rate. I saw 96, but I think we're in the same range there. Back to the note. He says, but the fact that they are wallowing in legal corporate bribes prevents meaningful change. Every state and nearly every member of Congress is mired in this two-party bribe fest. So no matter the specific issue your listeners are most concerned with, removing their member of Congress from the greed trough should be their number one goal right now. As you have said frequently, the House is up for firing every 2 years, and until we succeed in removing a fair number of the corporate shills sitting in Congress, the entire world is screwed. To that end, I ask people to identify the challenger to their incumbent members of Congress and do what they can to support that person. That could be money, door knocking, calling, or any other aspect of helping that person get elected. Write a letter to the editor, share info on social media, find out from that campaign what help they need, and roll up your sleeves. Thank you for listening, unquote. Well, if that isn't a perfectly appropriate ending to this episode, I don't know what is. So yeah, thank you for listening. I know this was a rantier episode than usual, but I'm fucking frustrated. So yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate everyone who's on this Congressional Dish team, from the people who are physically helping me create the episodes to everyone who has shared the episode and paid for it, and everybody in between. And thank you for listening too. Even if you're just listening, you know information that other people don't about Congress, and that matters. So thank you all. Thank you for letting me take a break for my birthday. I'm old, but I'm happy I have a job that, kind of matters to come back to. So, yeah, I appreciate y'all, and I will talk to you sometime in April. Thanks so much. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore.
bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.